Does cop arrests a black woman in a quiet store, sure she's up to no good, until she leans in, eyes burning, and whispers, "You just made the worst mistake of your career." Then, she slides a badge across the table. FBI, Undercover, and his arrest just blew a dangerous case wide open. But the real shock? The criminals she was after aren't just out there, they're closer than he ever imagined. How deep does the corruption go? And when the truth comes out, will he be the one behind bars instead? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights of Walker's General Store hummed overhead as Sergeant Joe Calloway pushed through the glass door. A small bell chimed, announcing his arrival. The familiar scent of pine cleaner and fresh bread from the small bakery section filled his nostrils, mingling with the musty smell of cardboard boxes waiting to be unpacked. He'd been here countless times before, responding to Evelyn's calls about suspicious characters that usually turned out to be nothing more than ordinary customers going about their business. Evelyn Walker, a thin woman in her 70s with perfectly coiffed silver hair, stood behind the counter. Her wire-rimmed glasses hung from a beaded chain around her neck, and her hands fidgeted with the edges of her worn blue cardigan. Her fingers, spotted with age, couldn't seem to stay still. The moment she spotted Joe, she waved him over with quick, nervous gestures, her bangles jingling softly. "Oh, thank goodness you're here, Sergeant," she whispered, though her whisper carried across the quiet store like a stage actor's aside. "She's over there in aisle 3, been looking at the same items for 20 minutes now, just standing there, reading everything." Joe's joints creaked as he straightened his back, fighting off the fatigue from a long day of routine patrols and paperwork. "Now, Evelyn, you know we've talked about this before," he said, keeping his voice low and professional, though exhaustion made the words heavy in his mouth. "People are allowed to browse." "But she's acting suspicious," Evelyn insisted, her thin lips pressed into a tight line, her face pinched with worry. She picked up the same can 3 times and put it back. "Who does that? And she's wearing such an expensive-looking suit for grocery shopping." Joe suppressed a sigh and rubbed his temple where a headache was forming. His watch showed 8:32 p.m., and he could feel the pull of his empty house and the leftover meatloaf waiting in his fridge. The thought of his quiet kitchen and comfortable armchair made this situation feel even more tedious. He should have been off duty 15 minutes ago, but here he was, dealing with another one of Evelyn's overreactions. He scanned the store, noting the few evening customers, an elderly man with arthritis-curved fingers examining produce, a teenage couple holding hands and giggling softly by the drinks cooler, and in aisle 3, exactly where Evelyn had indicated, a well-dressed black woman in her 30s. She wore a neat charcoal business suit that spoke of office meetings and corporate presentations, and was indeed studying the labels on various canned goods with careful attention. The woman's shoulders tensed slightly as she noticed his presence, though she continued reading the label in her hand, her manicured fingers gripping the can just a bit tighter. Joe recognized that subtle shift in posture. He'd seen it countless times before in his 27 years on the force. People getting nervous around cops, even when they weren't doing anything wrong. That instinctive tension that came from years of learned wariness. "I'll check it out," he told Evelyn, more to appease her than anything else. His boots squeaked against the freshly mopped linoleum as he made his way toward aisle 3, each step echoing in the quiet store. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, making everyone look slightly suspicious, slightly guilty, their features sharp and unfamiliar under the artificial glare. As he approached, the woman glanced up. Her eyes met his directly, showing neither fear nor defiance, just a quiet dignity that made Joe feel suddenly self-conscious about why he was really there. Her composure made him uncomfortably aware of his own role in this scene. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended, the words falling into the familiar rhythm of authority. Years of protocol kicked in automatically, even as part of him wished he were anywhere else. "Everything all right here?" "Yes, officer," she replied calmly, holding up the can she was examining. Her voice was steady, professional, like someone used to boardroom presentations. "I'm just checking the sodium content. My mother has high blood pressure, and I'm trying to find the right products for her new diet. Her doctor was very specific about the guidelines." Joe nodded, feeling the weight of his badge and the absurdity of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. Here he was, investigating someone for reading nutrition labels, playing out a scene that felt increasingly wrong with each passing second. The woman's explanation was simple, logical, and somehow made him feel like he was the one who needed to justify his presence. He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how this scene might look to others in the store. A uniformed officer questioning a professional woman doing nothing more suspicious than grocery shopping. The teenage couple had stopped their conversation to watch, their joined hands tightening, and even the elderly man had paused his produce inspection to observe the interaction, a head of lettuce forgotten in his weathered hands. "Take your time," Joe finally said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth like day-old coffee. He could feel Evelyn's eyes boring into his back from the counter, probably expecting him to do more, to somehow validate her concerns. But what was he supposed to do? Arrest someone for being too thorough with their shopping? The ridiculousness of the situation settled over him like a heavy blanket, making his uniform feel too tight around the collar. The bell above the door let out a cheerful jingle as Joe stepped into Walker's general store. The bright fluorescent lights made the linoleum floors gleam, and the familiar smell of cleaning products and fresh bread filled the air. A few regular customers nodded in his direction, used to seeing the town's most senior sergeant making his routine checks. Before he could take more than 2 steps, Evelyn Walker hurried toward him, her thin frame moving with surprising speed for someone her age. "She's still here?" Evelyn whispered urgently, her wrinkled hand gripping Joe's sleeve. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, but her eyes darted nervously as she pointed toward the back of the store. "Been here almost 30 minutes just looking, walking up and down the aisles like she owns the place." Joe followed her gesture, his eyes landing on a black woman standing in the last aisle. She wore a crisp blazer and tailored pants that spoke of city sophistication, not their small southern town. Her clothes looked expensive, the kind you'd find in big city boutiques, not the local department store. What caught his attention wasn't her appearance so much as her demeanor. Most people, innocent or guilty, tensed up when a police officer arrived. This woman didn't even glance his way. Something about her composure made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. She moved with deliberate grace, examining items on the shelves as if she had all the time in the world. Her fingers traced along product labels with careful consideration, like someone who was studying rather than shopping. It wasn't criminal behavior, but it wasn't normal either, not in his experience. Joe straightened his uniform shirt and walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing against the tile floor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he approached. The woman continued studying the shelves, seemingly absorbed in reading product labels. He cleared his throat, planting himself firmly in her line of sight. "Evening, ma'am. Mind if I see some ID?" His voice carried the authority of his 25 years on the force, the tone he'd perfected over countless similar encounters. The woman turned to face him, one eyebrow raised in a way that somehow managed to be both polite and challenging. Her dark eyes met his directly, unflinching. There was intelligence in that gaze, and something else, a quiet defiance that set him on edge. "And why would I need to show you that?" she asked. Her voice was smooth and controlled, with an edge of steel underneath. Joe felt a flicker of irritation build in his chest. People usually scrambled to comply when he asked for identification. Her calm resistance felt like a subtle challenge to his authority, and he didn't appreciate being questioned, especially not in front of the locals he'd sworn to protect. "Just a routine check," he replied, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't entirely truthful. There was nothing routine about responding to a call about a shopper who'd committed no crime. The familiar weight of his badge suddenly felt heavy against his chest. The woman, who he would later learn was Leah Carter, let out a measured breath. She reached into her handbag with deliberate slowness, her movements almost theatrical in their unhurried pace. Her fingers brushed past the leather exterior, but before retrieving anything, she paused, fixing him with a steady gaze that seemed to see right through him. "What's the charge, officer?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and challenging. Joe felt his jaw tighten, and his hand instinctively moved closer to his belt. He had no charge. They both knew it. but her questioning made his skin prickle with defensive anger. 25 years on the force, and this woman was making him feel like a rookie who'd overstepped. The familiar certainty of his position began to crack under her steady gaze. The tension stretched until Joe's patience snapped like a dry twig. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." His voice came out harder than he'd intended, echoing off the store's walls. In one fluid motion, he grabbed her wrist and spun her around, the handcuffs clicking into place before she could protest. The cold metal made a familiar sound that usually gave him satisfaction, but today it left him with an uneasy feeling in his gut. A few customers stopped to stare, their faces showing a mix of confusion and discomfort. Some quickly looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their shopping. Evelyn watched from behind her counter, satisfaction evident in her thin-lipped smile. Throughout it all, Leah remained silent. She didn't struggle or argue as Joe led her toward the exit. Her face was a mask of composure, but her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, stared straight ahead, giving nothing away. The weight of the moment settled over him like a heavy blanket, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that this arrest would come back to haunt him. The fluorescent lights of the booking area cast harsh shadows across Joe's face as he guided Leah Carter through the familiar process. His movements were mechanical, practiced from years of routine bookings, but something felt off. The woman's silence and composure set his teeth on edge. Most people he arrested showed some kind of emotion, anger, fear, desperation, but not her. She moved with a calm certainty that made him increasingly uneasy. "Stand here," Joe instructed, positioning her for the mugshot. His voice echoed slightly in the sterile room. Leah complied without a word, her dark eyes fixed straight ahead. The camera clicked, and Joe couldn't shake the feeling that she was studying him just as much as he was processing her. There was something calculating in her gaze that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In the interrogation room, the atmosphere grew even more tense. The small space felt cramped despite only having a metal table and 2 chairs. A single overhead light cast everything in shadows, but Leah's face remained perfectly composed. The faint hum of the ventilation system was the only sound breaking the stillness. Joe sat across from her, the booking sheet in his hands making a soft rustling sound as he reviewed the details, trying to focus on the familiar paperwork instead of his growing discomfort. Minutes ticked by on the wall clock, each second seeming longer than the last. The silence stretched between them like a rubber band ready to snap. Joe had interviewed hundreds of suspects over his decades on the force, but none had made him feel this unsettled. Something about her calm demeanor made him feel like he was the one being interrogated. Finally, Leah broke the silence. Her voice carried an edge of amusement that made Joe's jaw clench. A knowing smile played at the corners of her mouth as she spoke. "You just made the worst mistake of your career." Joe's fingers tightened around the clipboard, his knuckles turning white. The plastic crackled under his grip. He'd heard threats before, but something in her tone made this feel different. "And why is that?" he challenged, trying to maintain control of the situation, though his confidence was starting to waver. Leah leaned forward, her handcuffs clicking against the metal table. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made him want to look away. The fluorescent light caught the steel in her gaze. "You'll find out soon enough." Before Joe could respond, the door burst open with enough force to slam against the wall, the sound echoing through the small room like a gunshot. Captain Robert Hayes stood in the doorway, his usually commanding presence now tinged with something Joe had never seen before: fear. The captain's face was ashen, his normally neat tie slightly askew, and beads of sweat dotted his forehead. "Joe, what the hell did you just do?" Hayes demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. His hands were shaking as he gripped the doorframe. Joe stood up, confusion written across his features. The chair scraped loudly against the floor behind him. "Sir, The captain cut him off by holding up a manila file, his hand trembling slightly. Papers threatened to spill from its edges. "You just arrested a federal agent." The words hit Joe like a physical blow. His stomach dropped, and the room seemed to tilt sideways for a moment. The clipboard slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, clattering onto the table. He looked back at Leah, who hadn't moved an inch, but now her slight smile made perfect sense. The composure, the confidence, the way she had handled herself, it all clicked into place with devastating clarity. 20 years of experience as a cop, and he'd never felt more like a rookie than in this moment. The interrogation room felt even more confining than usual, as Joe stared at the gleaming FBI badge sliding across the metal table. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow on the official credentials now resting between them. Joe's throat constricted as a familiar sense of dread crept up his spine. "Go ahead, pick it up," Leah said, her voice steady despite the handcuffs still binding her wrists. There was a subtle challenge in her tone, as if daring him to confront the truth. "I think you'll find everything in order." With a trembling hand, Joe lifted the badge, his fingers closing around the solid weight of it. The embossed letters and official seal were unmistakable. This was no forgery. His stomach churned as he read the identification. Special Agent Leah Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. "This has to be a mistake," Joe muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But the grim expression on Captain Hayes' face told him otherwise. "It's not a mistake, Joe," Hayes said, running a weary hand over his face. "I just got off the phone with the FBI field office in D.C. She's one of theirs, and you just blew her cover." The words hit Joe like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. 6 months of undercover work, gone. A major federal investigation, compromised. All because he'd responded to a paranoid shop owner's call without a moment's hesitation. How was I supposed to know? Joe tried to defend himself, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "That's exactly the problem," Leah interjected, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "You weren't supposed to know. I was deep undercover until you decided to arrest me for shopping while black." Joe flinched at the blunt truth of her words, feeling the sting of her rebuke deep within his core. He had become an unwitting obstacle, protecting something far more sinister than he could have imagined. "The Bureau's been tracking a human trafficking ring," Hayes explained, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "Agent Carter was our best shot at bringing down the whole operation. Now ... He trailed off, the unspoken implications hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Joe's mind raced through the consequences, not just for his own career, but for the countless victims they might never save, the criminals who might never face justice. All because he had acted on instinct rather than reason, prioritizing order over true justice. "You think I'm your problem?" Leah leaned forward, her dark eyes boring into Joe's with an intensity that made him want to look away. "You have no idea who you just protected." The gravity of his mistake settled over Joe like a heavy blanket, chilling him to the core. In trying to maintain the system he had sworn to uphold, he had become an unwitting accomplice to something far more sinister than he could have imagined. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the interrogation room as Joe's fingers tightened around Leah Carter's FBI badge. His knuckles turned white from the grip, matching the color that had drained from his face. Sweat beaded at his temples as Captain Hayes' imposing figure filled the doorway, his jaw clenched so tight Joe could see the muscles twitch beneath his weathered skin. "You just compromised a federal case," Hayes growled, each word hitting Joe like a physical blow. His voice dropped even lower, rumbling with barely contained fury. "Years of work, gone, because you couldn't control yourself." Joe's mouth went dry, his tongue feeling like sandpaper. The badge felt heavy in his hands, like it was made of lead instead of metal, its golden surface catching the harsh overhead light. He glanced at Leah, still handcuffed to the chair, her posture straight despite the restraints. The composure that had irritated him earlier now made perfect sense, and it made him feel even more foolish. "It's not just my cover that's blown," Leah said, her voice as cold as winter rain. Her eyes never wavered from his face. "It's the entire operation. The people we were watching, they'll disappear now." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes boring into his, the metal handcuffs clinking against the chair. "And guess what, Sergeant? That's on you." Joe's face burned with humiliation, the heat crawling up his neck and into his cheeks. Anger bubbled up inside him, at himself, at her, at this whole mess. His hands shook as he set the badge down on the metal table with a soft clank. Leah studied him for a long moment, like she was deciding something important, her sharp gaze dissecting every micro-expression on his face. "You really don't get it, do you?" She tilted her head slightly, a strand of dark hair falling across her forehead. "Do you have any idea who you just protected?" "Enlighten me," Joe scowled, trying to hide how rattled he felt, his fingers drumming nervously against his thigh. Judge Thomas Garrett. The name hit Joe like a punch to the gut. He felt his body go rigid, his breath catching in his throat, his heart stumbling over its rhythm. Judge Garrett? The man who'd mentored him for years? The respected judge who'd helped shape Joe's entire career? "That's impossible," Joe said, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Judge Garrett is a pillar of the community?" Leah cut in, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. "That's what everyone thinks. That's what he wants everyone to think." Her words carried the weight of certainty that made his stomach churn. Joe shook his head, feeling like the room was closing in around him. This couldn't be right. Judge Garrett had taught him everything he knew about upholding the law. The judge who'd invited Joe to family dinners, who'd guided him through difficult cases, who'd always stressed the importance of justice. The memories felt tainted now, like photographs starting to curl and yellow at the edges. "You're lying," Joe said, but his voice lacked conviction, the words hollow even to his own ears. "You're either blind," Leah replied evenly, "or you're afraid to see the truth." The words stung like acid, burning through his carefully constructed worldview. Joe pushed back from the table, the metal chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech. Without another word, he stormed out of the interrogation room, nearly bumping into Hayes on his way out. The hallway seemed to spin around him as he walked, the familiar walls of the precinct suddenly alien and threatening. Judge Garrett? It had to be a lie. It had to be. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered a terrible question. What if it wasn't? The doubt crept through his mind like poison, tainting every memory, every moment of mentorship, every piece of advice the judge had ever given him. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the FBI field office in Atlanta, but it did nothing to warm the icy atmosphere inside. Leah Carter stood ramrod straight, her face a mask of controlled anger as she faced Special Agent Daniel Monroe. The office felt smaller than usual, cramped with tension and unspoken accusations. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Monroe's desk was covered in files, years of careful investigation now rendered useless. Coffee cups and scattered sticky notes testified to countless late nights of work. He glared at Leah, his face red with frustration. "You're off the case," he said, each word sharp as a knife. Leah's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her knuckles white with tension. "That's a mistake," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. All those months of work, all those connections she'd built, gone because of one small-town cop's prejudice. She could feel her career crumbling around her. Monroe slammed the case file shut with a bang that echoed through the office. Several papers fluttered to the floor. No, the mistake was trusting a local cop wouldn't screw up our entire operation. He stood up, towering over his desk, his tie slightly askew. "Do you have any idea how many resources we've wasted? How many victims we could have saved?" Back in Harrison County, Joe Calloway sat at his desk, staring into his fourth cup of coffee as if it might hold answers. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind like a bad movie. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night, and his wrinkled uniform showed signs of his restless tossing and turning. Captain Hayes appeared beside him, his presence causing Joe to jump slightly, spilling a few drops of coffee. "The FBI pulled Carter off the case," Hayes said quietly, glancing around to make sure nobody was within earshot. His weathered face showed concern. "The whole thing is dead." Joe's stomach churned with guilt. He'd ruined this woman's career, all because he'd acted without thinking, without questioning why he was really making that arrest. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in his mouth, and he pushed the cup away with trembling fingers. Hayes leaned in closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. His cologne couldn't quite mask the smell of stale cigarettes. Leah Carter was right about one thing, though. We just let monsters walk free. The captain's words sent a chill down Joe's spine. Later that morning, Joe looked up from his paperwork to see Leah walking through the station one last time. She moved with purpose, her head held high despite everything that had happened. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor, drawing curious glances from other officers. As she passed his desk, she stopped. Her eyes met his, and Joe saw something there that made him uncomfortable. Not anger or hatred, but a deep, knowing sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from seeing the truth and being powerless to act on it. "You don't believe me now," she said quietly. "But when the body starts showing up, you will." Joe watched her walk away, her words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. For the first time since this whole mess began, real doubt crept into his mind. The confidence in her voice, the sadness in her eyes, the way Hayes had spoken about monsters walking free, it all left him with an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. He found himself wondering if he'd been so focused on following procedure that he'd missed something vital. The sound of Leah's footsteps faded away, and Joe was left alone with his thoughts and the growing weight of what he might have done. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but somehow the shadows in the room seemed darker than before. The morning mist hung heavy over the Harrison County riverbank, turning the world gray and ghostly. Officer Luis Martinez's boots crunched through frost-covered leaves as he made his way down the muddy slope, responding to an anonymous tip about suspicious activity near the water. The bitter cold bit through his uniform jacket, making him wish he'd grabbed an extra layer before heading out. His flashlight beam cut through the fog, dancing across bare tree branches and thorny undergrowth. The weak winter sun hadn't yet risen high enough to penetrate the thick blanket of fog that clung to the riverside. Something caught his eye, a flash of pale color that seemed out of place among the browns and grays of the winter landscape. Martinez's heart started pounding as he moved closer, his training warring with his growing sense of dread. "Oh God," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. There, partially hidden by fallen leaves, lay a young girl. Her skin was nearly blue, her dark hair tangled with river weeds. Bruises marked her neck and wrists, telling a story of violence that made his stomach turn. Martinez stumbled backward, fumbling for his radio with trembling hands, nearly dropping it in his haste. "Dispatch, this is Officer Martinez. I need backup at the South Riverbank. And send the coroner." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. 20 minutes later, Joe Calloway's patrol car crunched to a stop on the gravel access road. He could already see the flashing lights through the trees, cutting red and blue slashes through the morning fog. His muscles felt tight as he grabbed his coffee cup, but it provided no warmth against the chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The steam rising from the cup disappeared into the misty air, carrying with it the familiar comfort of his morning routine. Martinez met him at the top of the embankment, his usual energetic demeanor replaced by something darker. "Sergeant, you need to see this." His young colleague's face was ashen, the morning's horror evident in his eyes. Joe followed Martinez down the slope, his boots sliding slightly on the wet ground. Crime scene techs were already setting up floodlights, pushing back the darkness. The harsh, artificial light cast long shadows across the scene, creating a surreal tableau of activity against the foggy backdrop. But nothing could have prepared Joe for what waited at the bottom. The girl couldn't have been more than 16. She lay on her side, one arm stretched out as if reaching for help that never came. Her clothes, what was left of them, were expensive. Designer labels, the kind of things a teenage girl would save up for, or maybe receive as gifts from someone with money to spare. A delicate gold bracelet still clung to one wrist, its charm dangling uselessly in the mud. Joe's coffee cup slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, splashing across his shoes. He barely noticed. Because there, stark against her pale skin, were the marks. Ligature wounds on her wrists, defensive bruises on her arms, signs of repeated trauma that matched, detail for detail, the reports Leah Carter had shown him in the interrogation room. The evidence was like a physical blow, shattering his carefully maintained denial. "When the bodies start showing up, you will..." Leah's words hit him like a physical blow. He'd dismissed her warning as the bitter words of a federal agent whose case he'd ruined. But now, standing in the cold morning air, watching frost form on the victim's eyelashes, the truth was impossible to ignore. "Sergeant?" Martinez's voice seemed to come from far away, echoing through the fog. "Are you okay?" Joe wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. His mind raced back through years of similar cases. Young girls from troubled homes, runaways, all dismissed as tragic but isolated incidents. How many times had Judge Garrett presided over these cases, steering investigations away from certain leads, ensuring key evidence was suppressed? How many times had Joe himself helped bury the truth without realizing it? The girl's vacant eyes stared past him, as if accusing him of his willful blindness. All those years, he'd taken pride in following orders, in not questioning the system. But what if the system itself was rotten? What if every commendation, every pat on the back from Judge Garrett had been part of something darker? For the first time in his career, Joe Calloway felt the foundations of his beliefs crack. What if Leah Carter had been right all along? And if she was right about this, what else had he been wrong about? The weight of 2 decades of certainty began to crumble around him. The sound of more vehicles arriving pulled him back to the present moment, tires crunching on gravel above. But the question remained, burning in his mind like acid. What if Leah was right? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? Joe Calloway's office felt smaller than usual as he sat hunched over his desk, the harsh fluorescent lights casting shadows across the crime scene photos spread before him. The young girl's face stared back at him, peaceful almost, if not for the bruises that marked her skin. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as his mind raced with unwelcome connections. The clock on the wall ticked away mercilessly, marking each moment of his growing dread. "It can't be," he muttered, but his hands were already pulling open his filing cabinet. The metal drawer scraped loudly in the quiet office as he began digging through old case files. One after another, he laid them out, creating a timeline of tragedy that stretched back years. His weathered fingers trembled slightly as he arranged each folder with methodical precision. Maria Rodriguez, 15, reported missing 3 years ago. Case dismissed due to lack of evidence. Sarah Thompson, 16, African American, disappeared last summer. File marked probable runaway. Jessica Martinez, 14, vanished 6 months ago. Case closed within a week. Each file told the same story of institutional indifference, each dismissal a knife in his gut. Joe's hands trembled as he flipped through page after page. The pattern emerged like a nightmare coming into focus. Young girls, all of them from vulnerable communities, all of their cases buried under bureaucratic excuses and legal jargon. His stomach churned as the pieces fell into place one by one. Then he saw it. At the bottom of each dismissal order, that familiar signature, Judge Thomas Garrett. The same elegant script he'd admired for years, the signature of his mentor, the man who'd guided his career. It appeared again and again like a brand of shame across every buried case. Each flourish of the pen now seemed to mock him, a testament to his own willful ignorance. "Dear God," Joe whispered, his throat tight. The weight of his own willful blindness crushed down on him. How many times had he accepted Garrett's decisions without question? How many lives had been destroyed while he looked the other way? The faces of all those girls seemed to blur together in his mind, a chorus of silent accusations. With shaking hands, he gathered the files into a neat stack. Each step toward Chief Briggs's office felt like walking through mud, but he forced himself forward. The chief's door was open, warm afternoon light streaming through the Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the worn carpet. Briggs looked up as Joe entered, his round face pleasant, almost jovial. "Calloway, what brings you by?" His voice carried its usual friendly tone, but something in his eyes made Joe's skin crawl. Joe placed the stack of files on the chief's desk. They landed with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the small office. "Sir, I need you to look at these." His voice sounded strange in his own ears, tight with barely contained emotion. Briggs barely glanced at the top file before closing it with a casual flick of his wrist. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes were cold. "I'd let this one go, Calloway, for your own good." The threat in his words was unmistakable, wrapped in a thin veneer of friendly advice. The words hit Joe like a physical blow. He stood there, frozen as the implication sank in. The chief's smile, the casual dismissal, the warning in his tone, it all clicked into place. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't bureaucratic oversight. The truth was far darker, far more insidious than he'd ever imagined. His own department, the people he'd worked with for decades, the men and women he'd trusted, they knew. They'd always known. The realization settled over him like a heavy shroud, suffocating in its weight. Joe's hand gripped the back of the chair in front of him, his knuckles white. The badge on his chest, once a source of pride, now felt like it was burning through his shirt. Everything he'd believed in, everything he'd dedicated his life to suddenly felt like a cruel joke. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered brick of Leah's apartment building as Joe shifted his weight from foot to foot. His police-issue boots felt heavy, matching the weight in his chest. He'd spent 20 minutes in his car rehearsing what to say before finally walking up to her door. The words still didn't feel right, but he knew he couldn't wait any longer. The hallway smelled of old carpet and fresh paint, an odd combination that made his nose twitch. A neighbor's door opened and closed somewhere down the hall, followed by the jingle of keys and receding footsteps. Joe wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and raised his fist to knock, his heart hammering against his ribs like a guilty verdict. Before his knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung open. Leah Carter stood there in casual clothes, jeans and a navy sweater that had seen better days, but her expression was anything but casual. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw him, and her whole body tensed like a coiled spring. Oh, hell no. The door started closing immediately, the hinges squeaking in protest. Joe's police instincts kicked in and his boot shot out, catching the edge. The impact sent a dull ache up his leg. "I need your help." His voice cracked on the last word, betraying his desperation. Leah's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass, echoing in the empty hallway. You? You need me?" She shook her head, her voice dripping with disgust. "You destroyed my career, and now you want my help?" Her fingers gripped the doorframe so tight her knuckles went white, the wood creaking under her grip. Joe's jaw clenched. The words felt like rocks in his mouth, but he forced them out. Someone else just died. The statement hung heavy in the air between them, like a physical thing. That stopped her. The hatred in her eyes didn't fade, but something else crept in, concern maybe, or resignation. She stood there for a long moment, studying his face like she was trying to catch him in a lie, her keen investigator's eyes missing nothing. "Another girl?" she asked finally, her voice softer but no less sharp, carrying years of frustration and pain. Joe nodded, his throat tight. 16, found her by the river. He swallowed hard. "Just like in your files, every detail matches." Leah's shoulders sagged slightly. She looked tired suddenly, the anger giving way to something heavier. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "And now you believe me about Garrett?" "I found his signature, on dozens of cases, all swept under the rug." The admission tasted bitter on his tongue, like old coffee and shame. "You were right. I was wrong. I should have listened sooner." She crossed her arms tight across her chest, her expression hardening again. The morning light caught the silver threads in her dark hair. "Fine," she said after what felt like forever. "But this time, you listen to me. And if you screw this up again, I will bury you. That's not a threat. It's a promise." Joe nodded, his shoulders dropping in relief. For the first time since this mess started, he truly believed every word she said. And somehow, that made him feel safer than he had in weeks. The fluorescent lights in Leah's modest apartment buzzed softly as Joe stood in the doorway, feeling utterly out of place. Her living room was sparse yet meticulously organized, with case files neatly stacked on the coffee table. The bare walls were adorned with only a single framed FBI commendation, a stark reminder of the career he had inadvertently derailed. You really think I'm going to help you? Leah's voice cut through the heavy silence, her tone sharp and laced with barely contained fury. Her dark eyes fixed him with an unwavering gaze. Joe shifted his weight, the leather of his jacket creaking as he did so. This was unfamiliar territory for him, asking for help, admitting he was wrong. It felt like swallowing gravel, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Look, I was wrong, he forced out, the admission difficult. But a girl is dead, and more are going to die. You're the only one who knows how to stop this. Leah remained motionless, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. The ticking of a wall clock filled the uncomfortable silence between them, as Joe could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, weighing his words against her deep-rooted distrust. Finally, Leah sighed heavily, rubbing her temples with her manicured fingers. Fine, she said, her voice weary. But let's get one thing straight. I'm calling the shots. If you screw this up again, I will not cover for you. Joe gave a stiff nod, his jaw clenched. After 25 years on the force, here he was, taking orders from someone else. But the haunting image of that dead girl by the river flashed through his mind, and his pride suddenly seemed insignificant. Leah moved to the coffee table and gestured to the neat stacks of files. Let's see what you've got, Calloway. Joe watched as she pulled more files from a locked drawer, thick manila folders stuffed with photos, reports, and sticky notes in her precise handwriting. She had continued investigating, even after being pulled from the case. These weren't official FBI files. This was her personal crusade, pursued in secret. As he flipped through the pages, Joe's stomach churned. The scope of what Leah had uncovered was staggering. Detailed timelines of missing girls, financial records showing suspicious transfers through shell companies, photos of meetings between people he had trusted his entire career, including Judge Garrett. The evidence was overwhelming. All this time, while he had been dismissing Leah as a troublemaker, she had been piecing together a massive criminal enterprise right under his nose. She had seen the truth while he had been too blind or too afraid to see it. Joe looked up from the files to find Leah watching him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, he truly saw her, not as an obstacle or a threat, but as someone who had been fighting alone for justice while he had helped the real enemies walk free. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Leah was never the enemy. He was. The kitchen clock ticked past midnight as Joe hunched over his worn oak table, the single desk lamp casting long shadows across scattered papers and photographs. Coffee cups, long empty, littered the surface, their brown rings staining important documents. His eyes burned from hours of reading, but he couldn't stop, not when he was finally seeing the truth. "This can't be real," he muttered, running his hands through his graying hair. His wedding ring caught the dim light as he dragged his fingers across his scalp. But the evidence was right there in black and white. Bank statements, property deeds, shell companies, all leading back to one man, Judge Thomas Garrett. Leah sat across from him, her face illuminated by her laptop screen, her features sharp with concentration. "Look at this," she said, turning the computer toward him. Her finger traced across rows of numbers. Every time a girl disappeared, there was a large deposit into this account in the Cayman Islands. The amounts vary, but the pattern is consistent. Some payments are as high as $50,000. Joe's stomach churned as he studied the dates, his coffee threatening to come back up. They matched perfectly with cases he'd worked on, cases where Garrett had assured him everything was being handled properly, patting him on the back with that fatherly smile. Cases that had been quietly buried, forgotten like yesterday's news. "Here's where it gets interesting," Leah continued, pulling up another document, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "These foundations, Friends of Harrison County, Children's Future Fund, Better Tomorrow Initiative, they're all registered to different people, but the money flows to the same place, like tributaries feeding a river of corruption." Joe recognized some of the names, and each one felt like a punch to the gut. Prominent citizens, business leaders, people he'd shared drinks with at the country club, laughed with at fundraisers, trusted implicitly. "The real estate companies are just fronts," Leah explained, her voice tight with controlled anger, a muscle working in her jaw. "They buy properties, convert them into temporary holding facilities, then sell them before anyone catches on. The police department's involvement. She paused, glancing at Joe, her expression softening for just a moment. Well, you can guess how that helped. Joe felt sick, his hands trembling as he reached for his cold coffee. He'd been part of this. Not knowingly, but his blind trust had made him complicit. Every time he'd looked the other way, every time he'd accepted Garrett's explanations without question. He'd helped keep this machine running, greased its wheels with his own integrity. The network is bigger than we thought, Leah said, pulling up more files, each one more damning than the last. These girls aren't just disappearing locally. They're being moved across state lines, sometimes internationally. Garrett's position as judge gives him the perfect cover. He can manipulate cases, suppress evidence, influence investigations. He's been playing puppet master for years. Joe picked up a photograph of Garrett at a charity gala, smiling broadly, his arm around Joe's shoulders. The judge's expensive watch glinted in the camera flash. They'd both received community service awards that night, standing ovation and all. The memory turned bitter in his mouth like ashes on his tongue. I trusted him, Joe said, his voice barely above a whisper, cracking with emotion. He mentored me, taught me everything I know about law enforcement. He laughed harshly, the sound echoing in the quiet kitchen. Guess now I know why he took such an interest in my career. Leah's expression softened slightly, understanding flickering in her eyes. That's how they operate. They pick people with integrity, earn their trust, make them feel valued. Then they use that trust as a shield. You're not the first good cop they've fooled, Joe. Joe stared at the evidence spread before him, his world crumbling piece by piece. Each document was another nail in the coffin of everything he'd believed in. His hands clenched into fists as anger replaced shock, hot and clarifying. We need to take him down, he said, meeting Leah's eyes with newfound determination. She nodded, a hint of approval crossing her face, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Now you're talking. Welcome to the right side of this fight. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Joe stood in Chief Briggs's doorway, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped animal trying to escape. The manila folder in his hands felt heavy with the weight of truth it contained, evidence that had taken months to gather, each page another nail in the coffin of his illusions. Through the office window, the setting sun cast long shadows across the worn carpet, painting everything in shades of amber and betrayal. What do you want, Calloway? Briggs didn't look up from his computer screen, his thick fingers still typing away with methodical precision, as if this was just another ordinary evening at the precinct. Joe stepped forward and threw the folder onto the desk, scattering some of Briggs' papers across the polished wood. Explain this. The chief's eyes narrowed as he picked up the folder with deliberate slowness, each movement calculated and controlled. Joe watched his face carefully, searching for any sign of surprise or shock, the normal reaction of an innocent man confronted with evidence of corruption. There was none. Briggs flipped through the pages, bank statements, property records, suspicious deaths, his expression never changing, like a poker player holding all the cards. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the gentle whir of the ceiling fan and distant voices from the squad room. Papers rustled as cars passed by outside, their headlights briefly illuminating the walls. Finally, Briggs closed the folder with a soft thump that seemed to echo in the tense atmosphere. I'd let this one go, Calloway, he said quietly, leaning back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. For your own good. The words hit Joe like a physical blow, leaving him winded. His mouth went dry, tongue sticking to the roof of his mouth. Are you threatening me? Briggs folded his hands on top of the folder, his gold wedding ring catching the light like a winking eye. His face remained calm, almost friendly, but his eyes were cold as winter frost. I'm giving you a chance to walk away. Joe's fingers curled into fists at his sides, nails biting into his palms. 25 years on the force, serving with pride and dedication, and now his own chief was telling him to ignore evidence of human trafficking. His voice came out rough like sandpaper against wood. You knew. All this time you knew what Garrett was doing. Joe. Briggs spoke his name like a parent addressing a stubborn child, with that particular mix of patience and condescension that made Joe's blood boil. "You're a good cop. Don't throw away everything you've built here. Think about your pension. Think about your reputation." "My reputation?" Joe barked out a harsh laugh that held no humor. "What about all those girls? What about justice?" "Justice?" Briggs shook his head slowly, a sad smile playing at his lips. "You still don't get it, do you? The system works exactly how it's supposed to work. People like Judge Garrett keep the machine running smooth. Sometimes that means looking the other way." Joe felt sick, bile rising in his throat. All these years he'd thought he was serving justice, protecting the innocent. But he'd just been another cog in a corrupt machine, turning blindly while people suffered. "Walk away," Briggs repeated, his voice soft but firm. "Take a vacation. Clear your head. When you come back, this folder will be gone, and we can all move forward." Joe stared at his chief, at the man he'd respected for decades, and saw him clearly for the first time. His hands were trembling as he turned and walked out of the office, leaving the folder behind like a bomb waiting to detonate. In the hallway, fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows that seemed to mock him. His footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor like a countdown. Everything looked the same. The familiar walls, the scuffed floors, the bulletin board covered in wanted posters. But nothing would ever be the same again. He was no longer just investigating corruption. He had become a threat to the very system he'd served his whole life, and he knew with chilling certainty that they would never let him walk away clean. The cheap motel lamp cast a sickly yellow glow across the room as Leah sat on the edge of the sagging bed, the worn springs creaking beneath her weight. Papers were spread around her like fallen leaves, each one another piece of evidence against Judge Garrett. Bank statements, property records, witness testimonies. Her dark eyes scanned document after document, looking for anything they might have missed, while her fingers absently traced the edge of a particularly damning financial report. The sudden buzz of her phone made her jump, scattering a few papers to the floor. She grabbed it, checking the caller ID. Unknown number. Her pulse quickened. "Carter," she answered, her voice professional despite her exhaustion and the late hour. A voice she didn't recognize, deep and distorted, spoke two simple words. "Check the news." The line went dead with an ominous click. Leah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the TV remote, her throat suddenly dry. The ancient television flickered to life with a static crackle, its screen showing a perfectly coiffed news anchor with a serious expression, her red blazer practically glowing under the studio lights. "Breaking news tonight," the anchor began, her voice crisp and authoritative, her expression grave. "Former FBI agent Leah Carter is under investigation for serious allegations of corruption. Sources within the Bureau claim Carter accepted bribes in exchange for covering up criminal activity during her time as an agent. Multiple witnesses have come forward." Leah's stomach dropped like a stone. The remote slipped from her fingers, clattering on the cheap laminate flooring. On screen, her FBI ID photo stared back at her, an older shot that made her look harsh, unfriendly. She barely recognized herself in that stern-faced woman. A sharp knock at the door made her flinch, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapon. "Leah?" "It's Joe." She crossed the room in 3 quick steps, her bare feet silent on the thin carpet, checking the peephole before letting him in. Joe's face was grim as he entered, his eyes immediately drawn to the TV where the news anchor was still talking about the shocking allegations and ongoing investigation. "They just buried me," Leah said, her voice barely above a whisper, thick with disbelief. She sank onto the bed, her shoulders slumping under the weight of what this meant. "Everything I say now, every piece of evidence I bring forward, they'll say it's all lies from a corrupt agent. They'll paint me as a desperate criminal trying to save herself." Joe stood there, his jaw working as he watched the news report, the muscles in his face twitching with barely contained anger, his fists clenched and unclenched at his sides. After 20 years of being a cop, he recognized a setup when he saw one. This wasn't just about silencing Leah, it was a display of power, a message to anyone else who might think about speaking up against Judge Garrett and his network. "We're not stopping," he said firmly, his voice cutting through Leah's despair like a blade through fog. She looked up at him, really looked at him, seeing the determination etched in every line of his weathered face. Gone was the arrogant cop who'd arrested her on a bogus call months ago. In his place stood someone different, someone who finally understood what they were up against and was ready to fight anyway. Badge and reputation be damned. For the first time since this unlikely partnership began, Leah truly believed Joe was on her side. Not just working with her out of guilt or duty, but genuinely committed to exposing the truth, no matter the cost. In that moment, despite the news still playing behind them, she felt a spark of hope. The news anchor's voice droned on in the background, but neither of them was listening anymore. They had work to do, and now they had even more reason to do it right. Joe's steps echoed through the deathly silent police station as he made his way to his desk, the usual friendly greetings from his colleagues, replaced by averted gazes and hushed whispers. The isolation weighed heavily on his shoulders. These were the people he'd trusted, worked alongside for years, yet now they seemed to shrink from his presence. Deputy Frank Miller, Joe's old friend, stepped out of the break room, his usual warm smile nowhere to be seen. Instead, a look of worry and guilt etched across his features as he blocked Joe's path. "Walk away, Joe," Frank muttered urgently. "This isn't worth it." Joe stared at his friend, the realization dawning that Frank was no longer an ally, but part of the very corruption he'd been oblivious to all this time. The betrayal cut deep, leaving Joe's throat tight with emotion. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Frank simply shook his head and walked away, abandoning Joe to face the sea of hostile, averted eyes and turned backs, decades of camaraderie crumbling around him. But Joe's resolve only hardened. If they thought this would break him, they were sorely mistaken. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled to the number of Sarah Martinez, the investigative reporter who had been digging into Judge Garrett's shady dealings. With a deep breath, Joe hit the call button, bracing himself for the consequences of exposing the truth, no matter the cost. The streetlight above Joe's parked car flickered erratically, casting shifting shadows across his weathered face and the dashboard's worn leather. His phone felt impossibly heavy in his hand as he stared at Julia Ramirez's number, each digit seeming to mock his hesitation. 25 years on the force, and he'd never once leaked to a reporter. Not once. But those 25 years meant nothing now. Not after what he'd discovered in those files. Not after seeing the truth with his own eyes. He thought about Leah, her promising career destroyed because she dared to tell the truth about what she'd uncovered. He thought about that dead girl they'd found by the river last week, her vacant eyes empty and accusing, her story forever silenced. His thumb pressed the call button before he could second-guess himself, before fear could win out over conscience. 3 rings echoed in his ear, then a crisp, professional voice answered. "Julia Ramirez." "It's Sergeant Joe Calloway." His voice came out rougher than he intended, scratchy with tension and guilt. A weighted pause followed. "Well, this is unexpected. The last time we spoke, you told me to, and I quote, 'Stop poking my nose where it doesn't belong.'" Her words carried a hint of amusement mixed with wariness. Joe winced at the memory of their last encounter. "Things change." "Do they?" Her tone was skeptical but interested, like a cat spotting movement in tall grass. "I have information about Judge Garrett, about corruption in Harrison County." The words felt like betrayal in his mouth, bitter and sharp, but he forced them out anyway. "You sure you want to do this?" Julia's voice had lost its edge, replaced by genuine concern that made his chest tighten. Joe's grip tightened on the phone until his fingers ached. "I don't have a choice anymore." He took a deep breath and began talking. He told her everything, about the trafficking ring operating right under their noses, about the offshore accounts hidden behind layers of shell companies, about how deep the corruption went in his own department. He told her about Leah Carter, about how they'd systematically destroyed her to keep her quiet. Julia didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. She just listened. The soft, steady sound of her typing the only indication she was still there, recording every damning word. When he finished, silence filled the line, heavy with implications. Finally, she spoke. "Meet me in an hour. Corner of Pine and Fifth. There's a diner there. Good coffee. Better privacy." "I'll be there." Joe hung up and started his car, the engine rumbling to life like distant thunder. As he pulled away from the curb, his phone buzzed against the passenger seat. A news alert lit up his screen. Breaking news. Federal cover-up and corruption allegations in Harrison County. His stomach clenched into a tight knot. There it was, in bold letters. The point of no return. Someone else had started talking too. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white against the worn leather. Everything would change now. His career, his life, everything he'd built over 2.5 decades. But maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what needed to happen. Sometimes the only way forward was through the fire. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sterile FBI interrogation room as Leah Carter sat perfectly still, her wrists bearing the angry red marks of last night's handcuffs. Her once crisp dark suit was wrinkled from spending the night in holding, but her posture remained rigid, dignified, a silent testament to her unwavering strength. Across the cold metal table, Special Agent Daniel Monroe studied her with the detached interest of someone examining an insect under glass, his pen tapping an irregular rhythm against his notepad. "You're officially cleared," he said finally, sliding a thick document across the table. His voice carried no warmth, no apology, just bureaucratic finality. Leah didn't reach for the paper, didn't even glance at it. She'd known this was coming, not because the FBI had suddenly grown a conscience, but because Joe Calloway had finally done the right thing. The detailed story he'd leaked to Julia Ramirez at the Herald had blown everything wide open, exposing years of corruption that could no longer be ignored. "Your badge and credentials will not be reinstated," Monroe continued, his tone clipped and dismissive. "The Bureau considers this matter closed. You understand there will be no further discussion." "Of course they do," Leah replied, her voice steady despite the anger churning inside her like a storm. Years of undercover work, countless successful operations, lives saved and criminals put away, all thrown away because she dared to expose the truth about Judge Garrett's empire. 2 stone-faced agents escorted her through the building's cold hallways, past former colleagues who suddenly found their shoes fascinating or buried their faces in conveniently timed phone calls. The weight of their betrayal pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. These people had known her, worked with her, trusted her, until it became inconvenient to remember her years of dedicated service. The morning sun hit her face as she stepped outside the building, a harsh reminder of freedom that felt bittersweet. Her career was over, her reputation in tatters. The FBI had made it crystal clear. She was damaged goods. A cautionary tale for agents who might consider stepping out of line. But they were dead wrong if they thought this would stop her from pursuing justice. A familiar figure leaned against a black sedan across the street. Joe Calloway straightened as she approached, his weathered face showing signs of sleepless nights and worry. Deep creases lined his forehead, and his tie hung loose around his neck. He'd risked everything to clear her name, something she hadn't expected from the man who'd arrested her just weeks ago in front of half the town. Leah stopped a few feet from him, crossing her arms against the morning chill. "You actually did it," she said, studying his face. The old Joe Calloway, the one who'd slapped handcuffs on her in Walker's General Store, would never have leaked to a reporter. He'd changed, and she could see it in the determined set of his jaw. "Had to," Joe replied simply, his voice gruff with emotion. "It was the right thing to do. Should have done it sooner." "Cost you everything," she observed, noting the empty holster at his hip where his badge should have been. "Not everything." He met her gaze steadily, a new fire burning in his eyes. "We're not stopping until Garrett is in cuffs, whatever it takes." For the first time in days, Leah felt her lips curve into a knowing smirk. Damn right. The massive lakefront mansion glowed like a beacon in the darkness, its reflection rippling across the still water like molten gold. Inside, Judge Thomas Garrett stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his wood-paneled study, swirling aged whiskey in a crystal tumbler that had cost more than most people made in a month. His perfectly coiffed silver hair caught the warm lamplight, and his tailored Italian suit still looked crisp despite the late hour, not a wrinkle in sight. The flat-screen TV mounted on the mahogany-covered wall blared the evening news. A young reporter's voice filled the room, each word landing like a hammer blow. Sources claim Judge Thomas Garrett's involvement in a human trafficking ring spans decades, with possible connections to organized crime and police corruption. Multiple witnesses have come forward. Garrett took a slow, measured sip of whiskey, his face a mask of stone. Not a flicker of emotion crossed his weathered features as his name was dragged through the mud. He'd spent 30 years meticulously building his reputation, his power, his influence. Now it was crumbling before his eyes like a sandcastle in the tide. Richard DeLuca, his personal attorney of 15 years, sat hunched in a butter-soft leather armchair nearby, his laptop open and casting an eerie glow. The blue light from the screen cast deep shadows across his worried face, highlighting the beads of sweat on his forehead. "The FBI is already freezing accounts," he reported, his fingers flying across the keyboard in desperate clicks. "We need to act fast before they trace everything. We need to shut this down now." Garrett's voice was cold as winter ice, controlled as a surgeon's scalpel. DeLuca nodded frantically, closing his laptop with a sharp snap. "We already started wiping your offshore accounts. I've made arrangements. Private jet, secured location, everything you need. We can have you in the Caribbean in 48 hours. No extradition treaty there." A small, dangerous smirk played at the corner of Garrett's mouth as he turned from the window, his reflection ghosting across the glass. "Let's make sure I don't have to run." He set down his glass with a soft clink against the marble coaster. DeLuca understood immediately, his face paling slightly. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through contacts. "The cop and the Fed?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, his voice barely above a whisper. "They started this mess," Garrett said, methodically straightening his silk tie in a nearby gilded mirror. "They can end it too." DeLuca pressed a number, waited for the line to connect, his breath shallow. When it did, his message was simple and chilling. "Make the cop and the Fed disappear." Garrett picked up his whiskey again, cold satisfaction settling over his features like a familiar mask. He'd eliminated threats before, watched them vanish without a trace. This would be no different. Calloway and Carter had no idea who they were dealing with, or what he was capable of when cornered. The sound of shattering glass jolted Joe awake. His heart hammered against his ribs as he grabbed his service weapon from the nightstand, his fingers instinctively finding the familiar grip in the darkness. The weight of the gun steadied his trembling hands, its cold metal a reminder of countless similar situations. Years of police training kicked in as he moved silently through his darkened house, checking corners, staying low, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floors. Another crash echoed from the front of the house, louder this time, more deliberate. Joe's breath caught in his throat, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. He pressed his back against the wall, inching toward the noise, every muscle tense and ready. The night air felt thick, heavy with danger, carrying the metallic taste of fear. When he reached his front door, the motion-activated porch light flickered on automatically, casting harsh shadows. That's when he saw it, and his stomach dropped like a stone. Bright red letters screamed across his pristine white siding. "Traitor." The paint was still dripping, leaving crimson trails like bloody tears, each droplet a testament to how recently the vandals had been there. Joe's jaw clenched until it ached as he pushed open the front door, weapon ready, his tactical training taking over. The cool night air hit his face as he stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards creaking softly beneath his weight. His eyes darted left and right, scanning the shadows that seemed to pulse with hidden threats. His patrol car sat in the driveway, and even in the dim light, he could see all 4 tires were flat, the rubber methodically slashed with precision that spoke of calculated revenge rather than random vandalism. Footsteps crunched on gravel, followed by low laughter that made the hair on Joe's neck stand up and his grip tighten on his weapon. A voice called from the darkness, dripping with malice and bitter amusement. "You're done, Calloway." Joe recognized that voice instantly, and the recognition felt like a punch to the gut. It belonged to someone who'd shared coffee with him countless mornings at the station, someone who'd backed him up on dangerous calls, someone he'd trusted with his life more times than he could count. Movement caught his eye, and a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of his property, moving with confident purpose. Frank Miller stepped into the harsh glow of the porch light, his face hard and unfamiliar, twisted into something cold and dangerous. This wasn't the friend Joe had known for 15 years. This was someone else entirely, a stranger wearing his friend's face. "Walk away, Joe," Frank said, shaking his head slowly, his badge gleaming dully in the artificial light. His voice carried a note of what almost sounded like genuine concern, like a friend giving advice. "You won't survive this." Joe stood straighter, squaring his shoulders against the weight of this betrayal. The bitter taste of disloyalty filled his mouth, but his voice came out steady and strong, carrying across the yard like a challenge. "Watch me." The defiance in those two words hung in the air between them, a final bridge burning in spectacular fashion. Frank's expression darkened, something dangerous flickering in his eyes before he melted back into the shadows, leaving Joe alone with the dripping red letters that marked him as a dead man walking in his own department, the paint still running like fresh wounds on his pristine white siding. The morning sun filtered through the coffee shop windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum table where Joe sat waiting. His hands wrapped around a cooling cup of black coffee, his third of the morning. The familiar scent did nothing to calm his nerves, and his stomach churned with a mix of caffeine and anxiety. The local diner had been their meeting spot for years, father and son sharing breakfast before shifts, swapping stories over pie and coffee. When Ethan walked in, Joe's heart clenched. His son wore his rookie police uniform with pride, but his face was hard, unforgiving. The sight made Joe's chest ache. He remembered teaching him how to ride a bike, coaching his little league games, staying up late helping him study for the police academy entrance exams. Now, Ethan looked at him like he was a stranger. Worse, like he was a criminal. "What the hell are you doing, Dad?" Ethan's voice was low, controlled, but Joe could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. His son's fingers drummed against his holster, a nervous habit he'd picked up at the academy. Joe didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the scratched tabletop. Coffee cups clinked at nearby tables, and the morning regulars chatted about weather and sports, oblivious to the tension crackling between father and son. The elderly couple by the window, the construction workers at the counter, their normal morning routines continued while Joe's world fell apart. Ethan stared at the folder like it might bite him. Finally, he opened it, his jaw tightening as he read. Page after page of evidence, bank statements, witness testimonies, photographs. The truth about Judge Garrett, about the department, about everything they'd believed in. Joe watched his son's face change as reality sank in, saw the moment denial turn to horrified understanding. His son's hands began to shake, then clenched into fists, crumpling the paper edges. With a sudden movement, he slammed the folder shut. The sound made nearby customers jump, and conversations stuttered to awkward halts before resuming in hushed tones. "You're turning your back on the people who raised you," Ethan spat, his voice trembling with rage. "These people, they're family. They trained me, supported me, believed in me. Captain Rogers was at my graduation. Sergeant Miller taught me everything I know about patrol work." Joe shook his head slowly, his heart breaking. "No, son. I'm exposing the people who used us, who used you. Everything they taught us about honor, about protecting people, it was all a lie." He reached out, trying to bridge the gulf between them, but Ethan recoiled from his touch. Ethan shoved his chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. He stood, towering over the table, his face flushed with anger and shame. The morning light caught his badge, making it gleam. "You're a disgrace," he said, each word precise and cutting. "You're not my father anymore." Joe sat there, unable to move as his son stormed out of the coffee shop. The bell above the door jangled harshly, and then silence fell. Other customers quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't witnessed the scene. The waitress hovering nearby with a coffee pot retreated to the kitchen, giving him space to collect himself. Joe stared at his cold coffee, feeling the crushing weight of isolation press down on his shoulders. Everything he'd built, everything he'd believed in, everyone he loved, all of it was crumbling away. The badge he'd worn with pride for 30 years now felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket. His phone buzzed against the table. Leah's name flashed on the screen. "I found Garrett," her message read. "Let's end this." Joe's fingers tightened around the phone, and despite everything, a spark of determination flickered in his chest. Maybe he'd lost his son, but he could still make things right. The evening shadows crept across the walls of Leah's safe house as Joe stepped inside, his body aching from the earlier attack. The room smelled of coffee and determination, with papers scattered across every surface and a large map dominating one wall. Red strings crisscrossed between photos, creating a web of corruption that led to one man. Empty takeout containers and energy drink cans littered the small desk, evidence of their relentless investigation. Leah looked up from her laptop, her eyes widening slightly at Joe's appearance. Dark circles under her eyes matched his own. "You look like hell. You should see the other guy." Joe attempted a smile, but winced as his split lip protested. His ribs screamed with each breath, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of showing weakness. The bruises on his face were already turning a deep purple. Leah stood up, her movements precise and focused. She brushed aside a stack of surveillance photos and pointed to a spot on the map, tapping it with her finger. "We found him." Joe moved closer, studying the location, the pain momentarily forgotten. The map showed a sprawling estate outside Savannah, Georgia. Satellite photos revealed a compound surrounded by thick woods and high walls. Security checkpoints dotted the perimeter like angry red dots. "Shell Company owned this place for years," Leah explained, pulling up documents on her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up more evidence. Perfect hideout, remote, defensible, and completely off the books until now. Joe leaned in, examining the security details. Guard rotations, camera positions, entry points. His stomach tightened as he counted the number of armed personnel. The faces in the surveillance photos were all too familiar. "These aren't just security guards," he muttered, his jaw clenching. "These are mercenaries, and—" He pointed to several familiar faces, each one a betrayal. "Those are cops. Our cops." "This isn't just an arrest," Joe said, his voice heavy with the weight of realization. "This is a war." Leah nodded grimly, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Garrett's got his own private army. Local police, hired guns, probably even some federal agents on his payroll. We go in there, we're outnumbered and outgunned." Joe straightened up, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side. He pulled out his phone, staring at it for a long moment before dialing. The number belonged to someone he hoped still had a conscience, someone who might remember what it meant to wear the badge with honor. Captain Hayes answered on the third ring. "Calloway." "I know you're still on the right side of this," Joe said without preamble, "even if you're scared. Are you in?" The silence stretched so long Joe thought Hayes had hung up. The soft hum of the air conditioning filled the tense quiet. Then, finally, the captain's voice came through, steady and clear. "Tell me when and where." Joe ended the call, feeling adrenaline surge through his battered body. This was it. The final fight was about to begin, and there would be no turning back. The full moon cast an eerie glow over Garrett's sprawling estate, its manicured lawns stretching into darkness like a vast green ocean. Joe crouched behind a thick hedge, his heart pounding against his Kevlar vest, sweat trickling down his back despite the cool night air. Beside him, Leah checked her weapon one final time, her movements precise and controlled, her face a mask of fierce concentration. Captain Hayes and 4 trusted officers spread out along the perimeter, their faces grim with determination, weapons at the ready. Through his night vision binoculars, Joe counted the mercenaries patrolling the grounds. 8 men, maybe more, moving with military precision, their automatic weapons held close to their chests. Inside the mansion's grand windows, he could see Garrett's silhouette, casually sipping whiskey like a man without a care in the world, his arrogance evident even from this distance. "Ready?" Leah whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air, her eyes locked on their target. Joe nodded, his jaw clenched tight. Now. The first wave of their attack moved like clockwork, a dance they'd rehearsed countless times. 2 silenced shots from Leah's rifle dropped the nearest guards without a sound, their bodies crumpling to the damp grass. Joe signaled Hayes, who triggered the diversion, a controlled explosion at the front gate that lit up the night sky like daybreak and sent shockwaves through the ground, rattling windows and teeth alike. Chaos erupted instantly. Mercenaries shouted orders in multiple languages, their boots pounding on gravel as they rushed toward the explosion. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, bullets whizzing past like angry hornets as Joe and Leah sprinted toward the mansion's side entrance, staying low and moving fast. They moved through the house room by room, their training evident in every fluid motion, checking corners and covering each other with practiced efficiency. Leah took down a mercenary with a swift combination of moves that left him unconscious, his weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. "Still got it," she muttered, stepping over his body, her breathing barely elevated. Joe rounded a corner and spotted Richard DeLuca, Garrett's right-hand man, running toward a hidden door behind an ornate tapestry. Without hesitation, Joe gave chase, his legs burning as he pursued the man through the mansion's maze-like corridors, past priceless artwork and antique furniture. DeLuca was fast, but Joe was fueled by years of pent-up rage and determination. He tackled him just as they reached a back stairwell, both men crashing hard against the marble floor with a bone-jarring impact. They struggled violently, but Joe gained the upper hand, pressing his service weapon against DeLuca's temple, his knee digging into the man's chest. "Where's Garrett?" Joe demanded, his voice raw with exertion and fury. DeLuca's laugh came out wet and red, his expensive suit now torn and dirty. "You're too late," he spat, blood staining his perfect white teeth, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "He knew you were coming. He's already gone." Joe felt his stomach drop as the implications hit him like a physical blow. Somewhere in the distance, gunfire continued to echo through the mansion's halls, but all he could hear was the sound of failure ringing in his ears, the bitter taste of defeat filling his mouth. The private jet's engines hummed in the midnight air, its sleek form gleaming under the floodlights. Judge Thomas Garrett walked across the tarmac with measured steps, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the concrete. His face showed no fear, only the practiced calm of a man who'd spent decades believing he was above the law. The pilot stood at attention near the stairs. Everything was ready. In a few hours, Garrett would be sipping cocktails in a country with no extradition treaty. He allowed himself a small smile. Crack. The jet's windshield exploded in a spiderweb of broken glass. Garrett stumbled backward, his composure finally cracking. From behind a fuel truck, Leah Carter emerged, her gun trained steadily on his chest. "Going somewhere?" Her voice carried across the tarmac, cold and precise. Garrett straightened his tie, trying to reclaim his dignity. "Agent Carter? Or should I say, former Agent Carter?" His smile returned, though smaller now. "This is a private airfield. You're trespassing." "Funny, that's not your biggest crime tonight." Leah kept her weapon level as she approached. Garrett's eyes darted toward the terminal building, looking for his security team, no doubt, but they wouldn't be coming. Joe had made sure of that. "You don't have proof, Carter. You have nothing." Garrett's voice carried the same authoritative tone he'd used from the bench for 30 years. The voice that had dismissed cases, buried evidence, and sent innocent people to jail while letting monsters walk free. Leah reached into her jacket with her free hand and pulled out a thick manila folder. She tossed it at his feet. Papers spilled out across the tarmac, bank statements, property deeds, signed documents, witness statements. Years of evidence finally seeing the light. Joe stepped out from behind the jet, his own weapon drawn. The sight of his former mentor standing there, finally cornered, made his chest tight. "You think you're untouchable," he said, but you're just another crook in cuffs." Garrett's facade cracked completely. His face twisted with rage as he looked between them. "You ungrateful bastard," he snarled at Joe. "I made you. Everything you are, you owe to me." "No," Joe said. "You used me. You used all of us." Blue and red lights suddenly flooded the airfield as FBI vehicles swarmed in from all directions. Agent Monroe stepped out of the lead car, flanked by tactical teams. Garrett's shoulders slumped as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. But as they led him toward the waiting vehicles, he turned to lock eyes with Joe one final time. "You're making a mistake, Calloway. The people protecting me, they're bigger than you think." Joe stood his ground, unflinching. "Good, let them come." The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Thomas Garrett, dressed in a bright orange jumpsuit, shuffled through the main entrance. His hands and feet were shackled, the chains rattling with each step. Joe Calloway stood at the back of the crowd watching his former mentors fall from grace. Gone was Garrett's commanding presence, his perfectly tailored suits, his air of authority. Now he looked small, old, defeated. The sight stirred something complicated in Joe's chest. Not quite satisfaction, not quite sadness. Just a hollow ache where respect had once lived. Inside the courthouse, whispers followed Joe through the halls. Some people nodded in approval, others turned away in disgust. A young clerk reached out to shake his hand, calling him a hero. An older bailiff, someone he'd known for years, spat at his feet. The news spread like wildfire through Harrison County. More arrests followed. 3 senior officers, 2 county officials, even a church leader who'd helped launder money. Each revelation hit the community like a physical blow. People struggled to believe that such evil had existed right under their noses. Some residents left flowers on Joe's porch. Others threw rocks through his windows. Signs appeared in yards, some praising his courage, others condemning him as a traitor. The town split down the middle, neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. At the FBI office in Atlanta, Leah Carter packed up her desk. She'd been offered a consulting position with a victims advocacy group. "Time to help people a different way," she told Joe over the phone. Her voice sounded lighter, unburdened. That evening, Joe sat alone in his living room, the house quiet except for the ticking of an old clock. His police badge lay on the coffee table, catching the last rays of sunlight through the window. 28 years of service condensed into a small piece of metal. He picked up the badge, feeling its familiar weight one last time. Everything it had once meant to him, honor, duty, justice, felt different now. Tainted. Changed. Without ceremony, Joe placed the badge back on the table. He stood up, walked to the door, and didn't look back. His time wearing that shield was over. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the wet pavement as Joe pulled up to Leah's apartment building. Rain pattered against his windshield, matching the rhythm of his uncertain heart. He sat there for a moment, staring at the resignation letter on the passenger seat. The crisp, white envelope held 15 years of his life, now coming to an end. With a deep breath, he grabbed the letter and stepped out into the drizzle. The walk to Leah's door felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of change. When he knocked, Leah opened the door quickly as if she'd been expecting him. She leaned against the doorframe, eyebrow raised. "Didn't expect to see you again," she said, but her tone suggested otherwise. Joe held out the envelope. "I'm done with Harrison County," he said simply. Then, with more conviction, "But I'm not done with this fight." Leah's expression softened. She stepped back, gesturing for him to come inside. Her apartment was neat but lived in, case files still scattered across her coffee table. She walked over and picked up a thick manila folder. "Good," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Because I have something for you." She tossed the folder onto the table between them. Joe picked it up, curiosity getting the better of him. Inside was an official-looking document with the FBI seal at the top. His eyes widened as he realized what he was looking at, a job offer. "I told you we needed someone who understands what's broken," Leah said quietly, watching his reaction. Joe exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance at redemption, a way to make things right. to fight the corruption he'd unknowingly protected for so long. He looked up at Leah, who was watching him with knowing eyes. This woman, whom he'd once arrested out of ignorance and prejudice, was now offering him a path forward. The irony wasn't lost on him. Standing up, Joe extended his hand. "So when do I start?" Leah's face broke into a genuine grin as she grasped his hand firmly. "Right now." In that handshake, both felt the shift, from adversaries to allies, from distrust to partnership. The real work was just beginning. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Joe Calloway settled into a hard wooden bench at the back. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting harsh shadows across Judge Thomas Garrett's face as deputies led him to the defendant's table. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, making him look smaller somehow, less imposing than when he'd worn his judicial robes. Reporters scribbled in notepads while sketch artists captured Garrett's fallen expression. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with townspeople, some shooting dirty looks at Joe, others nodding in quiet support. He ignored them all, focusing instead on Garrett's defense team, 3 sharp-suited lawyers with leather briefcases that probably cost more than Joe's car. When Leah Carter took the stand, the room fell silent. She wore a crisp blue blazer, her posture straight and confident as she was sworn in. Joe could see Garrett's lead attorney, James Morrison, practically salivating at the chance to tear her apart. "Ms. Carter," Morrison began, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "isn't it true that you were terminated from the FBI under suspicion of taking bribes?" "Those allegations were proven false," Leah replied evenly. "They were fabricated by your client's organization to discredit me." Morrison pressed harder, bringing up every mistake, every questionable call in her career. But Leah remained unshaken. When the prosecution's turn came, she methodically laid out the evidence. Bank statements showing millions flowing through shell companies, fake charities funneling money offshore, young girls trafficked across state lines. Garrett maintained his smug expression throughout her testimony, as if nothing could touch him, until Leah mentioned the recording. "The prosecution would like to enter Exhibit 47, the district attorney announced. A recorded phone call between the defendant and Richard DeLuca, dated March 15th. Garrett's face drained of color as his own voice filled the courtroom. "Clean it up. Make sure nothing leads back to us. And Richard, make it look like an accident this time." The jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some couldn't even look at Garrett anymore. His smirk finally cracked, replaced by something darker, fear. As the bailiff called an end to the day's proceedings, Garrett was led past Joe's bench. He paused, chains rattling. "You think this is over?" he sneered, his voice low and threatening. Joe met his former mentor's gaze steadily, unmoved by the hatred he saw there. "No," he replied, "but for you, it's damn close." The soft glow of a table lamp cast long shadows across Leah's apartment as she sat across from Joe, bourbon glass in hand. The amber liquid caught the light as she took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving his face. Between them, a crisp white envelope lay on the coffee table like a challenge. Leah reached forward and slid it toward him. "You've been doing this job without the badge for weeks now. Might as well make it official." Joe stared at the envelope, his weathered hands resting on his knees. 30 years of wearing a different badge had left its mark. The calluses from his service weapon, the slight tremor from too many late-night stakeouts fueled by cheap coffee. "I don't know about this," he muttered, finally picking up the envelope. The FBI letterhead stared back at him, bold and official. "What's there to know?" Leah asked, leaning back in her chair. "You're already neck-deep in federal cases. The only difference is now you'll get paid for it." Joe pulled out the contract, scanning the terms. Special agent, federal jurisdiction, a salary that made his police pension look like pocket change. His throat felt tight. "I'm a cop," he said quietly. "It's all I've ever been." "No," Leah corrected, pouring another finger of bourbon into both their glasses. "You're someone who fights for justice. The title doesn't matter." Joe ran his thumb over the edge of the paper. Everything in him screamed that this wasn't who he was. He'd spent 3 decades following a rulebook that turned out to be written by corrupt men. Now here he was, about to join the very agency he used to resent for interfering in local matters. "You gonna sign it or not, Calloway?" Leah smirked over her glass. "Some of us don't have all night." Joe picked up the pen she'd left beside the envelope. It felt heavy in his hand. With one signature, everything would change. Again. But maybe that was the point. He signed. Joe Calloway stood in his empty living room, the morning sun streaming through bare windows. The walls, once covered with family photos and police commendations, were now stripped clean. Dust outlines marked where frames had hung for decades. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as he made one final walk through. 30 years of memories lived in these walls. The corner where his son took his first steps, the kitchen table where he'd solved countless cases over late-night coffee, the worn spot on the couch where he'd fallen asleep watching baseball games. All of it, gone now. He locked the front door one last time, the key feeling heavy in his hand. The sold sign in the yard seemed to mock everything he'd built here. But there was no going back. Not after everything that happened. Walking down Main Street, Joe felt the stares. Mrs. Peterson at the grocery store quickly looked away when he passed, pretending to reorganize the produce display. Tom at the diner, who'd served him breakfast nearly every morning for 20 years, suddenly became very interested in wiping down the counter. "Traitor," someone muttered as he passed the barber shop. Joe kept walking, head high. Outside the pharmacy, an elderly man spat on the sidewalk near his feet. Joe didn't flinch. He'd expected this. When you expose corruption in a small town, you become the enemy to those who benefited from it. But then he saw her, Maria Santos, clutching her young son's hand as they walked toward him. Joe remembered her brother's case, one of many that Garrett had buried. Instead of avoiding his gaze like the others, she pulled her son closer and looked directly at Joe. "Thank you," she whispered as they passed, her voice thick with emotion, "for telling the truth." Joe nodded once, a lump forming in his throat. This was why he'd done it. Not for praise or recognition, but for people like Maria who deserved justice. Back at his truck, Leah Carter sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as he approached, raising an eyebrow at his expression. "You okay?" she asked as he climbed in. "Yeah," Joe replied, gripping the steering wheel. "Just saying goodbye." Leah glanced at him. "Where to?" Joe started the engine, the familiar rumble matching his determination. "Wherever the next fight is." The gleaming glass and steel of the FBI headquarters towered above Joe Calloway as he walked through the security checkpoint. His new badge felt heavy against his chest. Not the familiar weight of his old police shield, but something different. Something that meant real change. Inside, the bustling office hummed with activity. Agents moved purposefully between desks, their conversations a mix of case details and operational planning. Computer screens displayed data streams and surveillance footage. This was a far cry from the dusty filing cabinets and coffee-stained desks of Harrison County. "Different from what you're used to, huh?" Leah appeared beside him, a knowing smile on her face. She'd been right. He did belong here, even if it still felt strange. "Like comparing a pickup truck to a Ferrari," Joe admitted, following her through the maze of workstations. They reached a glass-walled conference room where 3 other agents sat waiting. Leah made quick introductions. "Team, meet Joe Calloway, former Harrison County PD, now one of us. Joe, meet Special Agents Thompson, Rodriguez, and Chen." The agents nodded professionally, already treating him as one of their own. No sideways glances, no whispered comments about being a traitor. Here, taking down corruption wasn't betrayal. It was the mission. Leah pulled out a thick manila folder and handed it to Joe. "Ready for your first official case?" Joe took the file, feeling its weight. Inside were photographs, financial records, and surveillance reports. The target, a network of judges and politicians across 3 states, all connected to a series of suspicious deaths and missing person cases. "Looks familiar," Joe said quietly, thinking of Garrett. "That's why you're here," Leah replied. "You've seen how deep this goes. You know what to look for." Joe flipped through the pages, recognizing the patterns. Shell companies, offshore accounts, missing witnesses. It was Garrett's playbook on a larger scale. "These people think they're untouchable," Leah continued. "They've got friends in high places, political connections, dirty cops on their payroll." Joe looked up from the file, meeting her eyes. "Good thing we're not cops anymore." Leah smiled, that same determined smile she'd had when they first took down Garrett. Exactly. No more jurisdictional boundaries. No more political pressure to look the other way. This time, we go all the way to the top. Joe closed the file, his mind already mapping out the investigation. This was why he was here. Not to write tickets or make routine arrests, but to fight the real monsters, the ones hiding behind badges and gavels. "Let's get to work," he said, ready to begin. The dim light of the DC bar cast long shadows across worn wooden tables as Joe Calloway nursed his bourbon. Across from him, Leah Carter swirled her whiskey, ice cubes clinking against the glass. The familiar sounds of bar chatter and classic rock filled the comfortable silence between them. "You think we actually made a difference?" Joe asked, a hint of a smirk playing at his lips. The question had been nagging at him since they'd left Harrison County behind. Leah shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "A little, but there's always another fight." She took a slow sip of her drink. Garrett was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Joe nodded, remembering the look in Garrett's eyes as they led him away in handcuffs. "Still can't believe how deep it went. All those years right under my nose." "That's how they operate," Leah said. "Hide in plain sight, use respect and authority as shields." She paused, studying her glass. "At least now we're fighting it from the right side." The moment was interrupted by a sharp buzz. Leah's phone vibrated against the wooden table. She picked it up, her face immediately darkening as she read the message. "We got a problem," she said, her voice dropping low. Without explanation, she slid the phone across the table. Joe picked it up, scanning the message. His stomach tightened as he read the name. This wasn't just another corrupt official or local crime ring. This target had connections in places that made Garrett look like small-time criminal. The implications made his head spin. "They're sure about this?" he asked, sliding the phone back. Leah nodded grimly. "Triple verified, and it gets worse." She leaned forward, lowering her voice further. "The people protecting this one? They make our old friends look like amateurs." Joe absorbed this, feeling the familiar surge of determination rising in his chest. He'd come too far to back down now. Without a word, he finished his bourbon in one swift motion and grabbed his coat. "Looks like we've got work to do," he said, standing up. Leah smirked, following his lead. "Took you long enough." She pulled on her jacket, leaving cash on the table for their drinks. They walked out of the bar together, stepping into the cool DC night. The next fight was waiting, and they were ready. Joe Calloway pushes through the glass doors of the FBI's Organized Crime and Corruption Task Force, his new badge feeling foreign against his hip. The sleek, modern office space is a far cry from the worn-down precinct he called home for 3 decades. Agents in crisp suits bustle past him, their conversations a mix of case details and tech jargon he barely understands. Leah Carter stands in a doorway, arms crossed, watching him with that knowing smirk he's come to recognize. "Feeling lost, rookie?" Joe adjusts his tie, another new addition he's not quite comfortable with. "Try old as hell." His voice carries a self-deprecating chuckle. Leah pushes off the doorframe and gestures toward a conference room. "Come on, time to meet the team." Inside, 5 agents sit around a polished table, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Joe recognizes the type. They're wondering what an old, small-town cop is doing in their elite unit. Assistant Director Mark O'Connell, a stern-faced man in his 50s, stands at the head of the table. He drops a thick manila folder with a heavy thud. "Welcome to your first case, Calloway. Hope you weren't looking for an easy one." Joe flips open the file and his stomach tightens. Senator William Trask's photo stares back at him. Distinguished, powerful, untouchable. The charges listed beneath make his blood run cold. Money laundering, racketeering, ties to organized crime. But what really catches his attention are the names of the law enforcement officials allegedly protecting him. He exhales slowly, feeling the weight of what they're up against. It's like Judge Garrett all over again, but this time the stakes are higher, the players are bigger, the consequences more severe. The meeting continues as O'Connell outlines their strategy, but Joe's mind is already racing. He's seen this before. Powerful men who think they're above the law, protected by a network of corrupt officials. Only this time, it's not just a small-town judge, it's a United States senator. When the briefing ends, Joe stays behind, studying the evidence board. Photos, financial records, and connection maps cover every inch. This isn't just about one corrupt man. It's about an entire system designed to protect criminals at the highest level. Leah appears beside him, her presence now familiar and oddly comforting. "You good?" Joe clenches his jaw, his resolve hardening. "Let's bring the bastard down." Joe's footsteps echo in the empty hallway as he unlocks the door to his new DC apartment. The space is bare, functional. A bed, a desk, some basic furniture the FBI arranged for him. No family photos. No familiar coffee stains on the counter. Nothing that speaks of a life lived. He drops his keys on the kitchen counter and loosens his tie, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. The Senator Trask case files are spread across his mind like crime scene photos, each detail more disturbing than the last. His phone buzzes in his pocket. Joe pulls it out, expecting Leah with more case details. Instead, an unknown number flashes on the screen. His thumb hovers over the message for a moment before opening it. "You should have stayed retired, Calloway." Below the text is a photo that makes his pulse quicken. Him and Leah walking out of the FBI building just hours ago. The angle suggests it was taken from across the street, probably with a long-range lens. Professional surveillance. Joe's jaw tightens as he studies the image. This isn't like Harrison County, where threats came from dirty cops who telegraphed their punches. These people operate in shadows, with resources that make his old department look like a high school security team. His fingers are already dialing Leah's number. She picks up on the second ring. "Carter." "We've got a problem," Joe says, moving away from the windows. "Someone's watching us. Just got a message with surveillance photos from today." Leah's voice turns sharp. "Send it to me, now." Joe forwards the message, then starts methodically checking his windows, drawing blinds, testing locks. "These aren't small-town thugs, Leah. This is different." "Welcome to the big leagues, Calloway." Leah's voice is grim. "This is what happens when you go after people with real power. They don't just threaten, they make examples." Joe checks his service weapon, making sure it's loaded and within reach. He settles into a chair in the darkened living room, his back to the wall, eyes on the door. The threat doesn't frighten him, not really. Back in Harrison County, he had everything to lose. His reputation, his career, his place in the community. Now, he's already lost it all. "I'll have our tech team trace the number," Leah says, "but don't expect much. These people know how to stay hidden." "Let them hide," Joe replies, his voice steady. "We'll find them anyway." 2 weeks later, Joe and Leah sit in a dimly lit room of an unmarked safe house somewhere outside DC. The location is need-to-know only. Their informant, Marcus Chen, former aide to Senator Trask, wrings his hands nervously as he places a small USB drive on the scratched wooden table between them. "This has everything," Marcus says, his voice barely above a whisper. "Financial records, meeting transcripts, surveillance footage. But if you use it..." He glances over his shoulder, though they're completely alone. "You won't just take down Trask. You'll be at war with people you can't even name." Leah picks up the drive, turning it over in her hands. Her expression is unreadable, but Joe notices the slight tension in her shoulders. She plugs the drive into her encrypted laptop, and they watch as files begin populating the screen. Names scroll past. Judges, police chiefs, corporate executives. Bank transfers linking shell companies to intelligence agencies. Evidence of systematic bribery reaching into every corner of law enforcement and government. Each document reveals another layer of corruption, another tentacle of this massive machine designed to protect the powerful. Joe's stomach tightens as he realizes what they're looking at. This isn't just about one corrupt senator. It's not even about a network of corrupt officials. It's an entire system, built over decades, designed to keep power concentrated in the hands of those who abuse it. These accounts, Leah mutters, pointing to a series of offshore transfers. They're linked to 3 different intelligence agencies. And look at these shell companies. They're being used to funnel money through major corporations, law firms, even charitable foundations. Joe leans back in his chair, the weight of understanding settling on him like a heavy blanket. "This won't end, will it?" he asks, though he already knows the answer. Leah shakes her head slowly, her eyes still fixed on the screen. "Not in our lifetime." The silence that follows feels heavy, meaningful. Joe stares at the laptop, at the evidence of corruption so vast it seems almost impossible to fight. Everything he thought he knew about justice, about right and wrong, seems small compared to this. He closes the laptop with a quiet click, exhales slowly, then looks at Leah. "Then let's get to work." The screen fades to black. If you enjoyed the story of Joe, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. If you enjoyed the story of Joe, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.